There is something inside some people that should not have survived, not because it is rare, but because for thousands of years it quietly killed too many children to deserve a place in the future. And yet tonight it still flows through millions of bodies, unapologetic, unexplained. If evolution is ruthless, if it removes what threatens survival, then why was this never erased? Why did it stay? Once the existence of Rho-negative blood is accepted as a biological contradiction, the real question becomes unavoidable. What did this trait actually do to human survival? Because A-negative blood is not a harmless variation, it is not cosmetic, it is not neutral. Under very specific conditions, it turns pregnancy itself into a biological risk. The human immune system is designed with one primary goal: protection. It identifies what belongs to the body and eliminates what does not. This process works with remarkable precision in almost every context. Infection, injury, foreign tissue, the response is clear. But pregnancy forces biology into an exception. A fetus is genetic distinct. Half of its DNA comes from another person. Under normal circumstances, the immune system must tolerate this difference. It must remain quiet long enough for reproduction to succeed. In Rho-negative mothers carrying an Rho-positive fetus, the tolerance can fail. During pregnancy or delivery, fetal blood cells can enter the mother's bloodstream. If the mother lacks the Rho protein, her immune system may recognize those cells as foreign. The response is not immediate catastrophe, it is learning. The immune system produces antibody, it remembers the encounter. This memory is permanent. The first pregnancy often survives because the immune response has not yet fully formed. The danger emerges later in subsequent pregnancies with Aries-positive fetuses. The mother's immune system responds faster and more aggressively. Antibodies cross the placenta, they attack fetal red blood cells, organs suffer. In severe cases, the fetus dies before birth or shortly after. This condition, hemolytic disease of the newborn, was once a common cause of infant mortality. This is not a rare edge case. For most of human history, there was no prevention, no screening, no intervention. The mechanism operated silently across generations. From an evolutionary standpoint, this is critical. Any trait that repeatedly reduces sex for reproduction, fewer surviving children means fewer descendants carrying the trait. Natural selection is not subtle about this. It removes costly traits without hesitation, and yet Rho-negative blood survived. Not only did it survive, it remained concentrated in certain population. This is where the evolutionary puzzle becomes sharper. If the trait were universally harmful, it would decline everywhere. If it were beneficial, it would spread. Rho-negative blood did neither. Instead, it persisted unevenly, rare in many regions, common in a few. This distribution matters. Rho-negative blood reaches unusually high frequencies, groups with limited migration, limited genetic mixing, small population sizes. In such environments, selection pressure competes with randomness. A trait does not need to be advantageous to persist. It only needs to avoid being fatal often enough. Reproductive loss from Rho incompatibility was real, but it was not absolute. Not every pregnancy failed. Became sensitized, enough children survived to carry the trait forward. This incomplete selection allowed the trait to remain trapped within specific genetic pools, not because it was useful, but because evolution failed to remove it completely. This exposes a misunderstanding about natural selection. Evolution does not create optimal outcomes, it creates survivable ones. Traits are not eliminated. They are eliminated only when their harm outweighs chance and population structure. Rho-negative blood existed in a narrow window where its cost was severe but inconsistent. Inconsistency mattered. For thousands of years, this cost expressed itself as pattern, not explanation. Families noticed repetition without understanding ending. Another ending earlier, the pattern did not affect everyone equally, but it appeared often enough to shape behavior, fear of repeated childbirth, social explanations, blame placed on the mother's body. None of this altered the biology. When modern medicine finally identified the Ray factor, the paradox did not disappear. It became clearer. Prevention was introduced. A single injection could prevent immune sensitization. A cycle that had lasted for millennia could be interrupted in one generation. But this solution arrived after the evolutionary process had already failed to remove the trait. Understanding the mechanism explains how the damage occurred. It does not explain why the trait was allowed to persist for so long. The answer lies in the limitations of evolution itself. Natural selection does not operate globally. It operates locally. It does not optimize across the entire species. It filters within populations when populations are small, isolated, or stable. O-negative blood was never selected for it was tolerated. It remained because the conditions required to remove it were never strong enough, widespread enough, or consistent enough. This is not a mystery of purpose, it is a demonstration of imperfection. Even today, the trait remains biologically relevant, not because it confers an advantage, but because its absence reduces immune reaction in blood transfusion. In emergencies, raw negative blood can be given more safely across recipients. This modern utility does not retroactively justify its survival. It is a secondary consequence, not a reason. The central question remains unchanged. Why did evolution not eliminate O-negative blood? Because evolution does not guarantee efficiency. And Rho-negative blood continued because it existed within the narrow margins where removal never fully succeeded. This is not an inspiring answer, it is a cold one. The trait survived not because it helped humanity, but because humanity was never unified enough for selection to erase it. Biology moved forward unevenly. The cost was paid locally. The trait endured globally. That is the foundation of this story. Not mystery, not superiority, not destiny. A simple failure of selection to complete its task. And that failure is what allowed N-negative blood to reach the present day. This persistence becomes easier to understand when population dynamics are examined more closely. It acts on populations over time. When populations are large and interconnect, harmful traits are diluted and removed faster. But when populations are small, stable, and genetic isolated, selection weakens. Ret-negative blood existed primarily in those conditions. In such environments, survival depends less on optimization. A trait can be harmful and still persist if it does not eliminate reproduction entirely. Ray incompatibility did not prevent all births, it reduced success unevenly. Some women never became sensitized, some pregnancies avoided maternal blood mixing, some children survived by chance. That randomness was enough to keep the trait alive. This explains why Ray-negative blood did not spread globally, but also why it never vanished. It was trapped inside specific gene pools, carried forward not by advantage, but by incomplete elimination. Evolution did not preserve it, evolution failed to erase it. This failure had consequences long before modern medicine. Repeated pregnancy lost shape behavior. Families adjusted expectations. Cultural explanations emerged to replace biological ones. None of these responses reduced the genetic cause. They only altered how its effects were lived. When Ra incompatibility was finally understood, the solution did not involve changing the trait itself. It involved reinterventing the immune system from learning. The body was prevented from remembering the fetus as foreign. The trait remained unchanged. Only its consequences were managed. This distinction matters. Rho-negative blood was not corrected. It was controlled. The biology stayed exactly the same. The evolutionary outcome was frozen in place. From that point forward, natural selection could no longer act on the trait in the same way. Medical intervention removed the reproductive cost. What evolution failed to eliminate, medicine stabilized. This introduces a modern layer to the paradox. A trait that once reduced reproductive success now carries little cost, not because it became safer through evolution, but because technology entered. The selective pressure disappeared. Rho-negative blood now persists indefinitely, not as a mystery, but as a managed condition. Even so, its distribution still reflects the past. The same populations that once experienced higher reproductive risk still carry higher frequency today. Modern medicine did not change where the trait exists. It only changed what happens when it appears. This reinforces the central explanation. Raw negative blood exists today because it was never fully removed. When it mattered, evolution did not complete the process. Once medicine intervened, the opportunity for removal ended. The trait crossed from biology into management. There is no hidden benefit required to explain this. No ancient purpose. And negative blood survived because selection pressure was immediate and inconsistent. It was costly, but not catastrophic enough. Harmful, but not decisive. That is all it takes for a trait to remain. This is what makes the story uncomfortable. It is not about mystery, it is about limits. The limits of assuming survival equals design. Raw negative blood is not an exception to evolutionary rules. It is a reminder that those rules are imperfect in practice, and it is within those imperfections that this trait endured. Which means the story cannot stop at biology alone, because once a trait survives past the point where natural selection should have removed it, its consequences stop being purely genetic and begin to shape behavior, structure, and decision-making in ways that feed back into survival itself. In populations where raw negative blood was common enough to be noticed but not understood, reproductive risk altered family strategies without anyone knowing the cause. Pregnancy became something to fear rather than assume. Women who lost multiple children were not seen as unlucky in an abstract sense, but as dangerous carriers of something unseen. In some cases, reproduction slowed deliberately, not because people understood right incompatibility, but because repeated loss taught caution at a cultural level. This matters because natural selection does not operate in isolation from behavior. When humans change how often they reproduce, whom they reproduce with, their negative blood reduced successful births in specific contexts, but human responses to loss softened its impact in others. Fewer pregnancies meant fewer opportunities for immune sensitization. Delayed childbirth altered exposure. Social adoption unintentionally reduced biological risk. These responses were not coordination, but they were enough to further fragmentation. At the same time, the danger remained invisible. At the population level, incompatibility did not create sudden extinction events. It created quiet attrition. Infants died individually, not collectively. Families suffered in isolation. Loss was absorbed into bacteria, malnutrition, or complications of labor. When harm is diffuse and slow, it weakens its own force. Air and negative blood existed in exactly that space where damage was real but indistinct. This explains why the trait persisted even before medical intervention. It was costly, but it failed to generate a clear enough signal for selection to act decisively. And when modern medicine finally entered the picture, that weak pressure disappeared entirely. Once immunoglobulin prevented antibody formation, reproductive failure dropped sharply from an evolutionary perspective, went to zero. At that moment, natural selection lost any remaining influence over its frequency. This transition marks a critical boundary. Before medicine, raw negative blood survived because selection was incomplete. After medicine, it survived because selection was no longer relevant. The trait crossed from being a biological liability to a managed condition. Evolution did not finish its work, and technology froze the outcome mid-process. What remains today is not a trait being shaped by nature, but one being maintained by systems designed to override nature's filtering mechanisms. This is why modern discussions about raw negative blood often drift towards symbolism. When biology no longer explains change, people look for meaning. Rarity becomes importance. Persistence becomes intention. But none of that is required to explain the outcome. The trait remains because nothing is acting strongly enough to remove it anymore. That is the full explanation, even if it feels unsatisfying. Importantly, this persistence does not imply advantage. Negative blood does not increase fertility, longevity, or resistance to disease. It arises from absence, not function. Fewer antigens mean fewer immune reactions, which makes transfusions safer across recipients. But this benefit only exists within the artificial context of medical systems. It played no role in the trait's survival across evolutionary time. This distinction must remain clear. Negative blood was not preserved. because it helped humanity survive. Humanity survived despite it, and once technology reduced its cost, the question of removal became irrelevant. Evolution does not reverse traits without pressure. In the absence of cost, frequency stabilizes. That is what we see now. Looking at the present distribution of Rho-negative blood is therefore like looking at a fossilized process. The pattern reflects ancient population, structure, historical isolation, and incomplete selection, not modern advantage. The trait tells a story about how evolution actually works in real populations, where pressure is uneven, behavior interferes, and chance competes with optimization. This is why R-negative, but as evidence of limitation. It demonstrates that natural selection is not a precise sculptor, it is a blunt filter. It removes what is overwhelmingly destructive and ignores what falls below that threshold. All incompatibility existed below the threshold for removal in enough places for long enough to persist into the modern world once that framework is accepted. The discomfort shifts. The question is no longer why this trait exists, but how many others like it remain unnoticed. Traits that should have been removed, but were not, traits whose costs were local, inconsistent, or masked by behavior. Traits that persist not because they serve a purpose, but because the conditions required to erase them never aligned. Negative blood is simply one of the clearest examples, because its cost is tied directly to reproduction. The very process evolution is supposed to optimize, that is survived anyway, forces a recalibration of expectation. Evolution does not guarantee clean outcomes. The Garinette sense, Rho-negative blood is not an anomaly. It is a reminder that survival is often a matter of tolerance rather than design, and that what reaches the present day is not always what worked best, but what was never removed when it mattered most, and therefore continued forward as the species adapted around it rather than eliminating it entirely, while time moved on and the trait remained embedded quietly within the population, waiting for nothing because nothing was coming to challenge it again. This persistence also changes how the trait should be interpreted in the present, because once evolution stops acting on a feature, what remains is no longer shaped by survival pressure, but by historical inertia. Rho-negative blood today is not moving toward extinction or expansion. For biological reasons, its frequency reflects decisions made long ago by population size isolation. What looks like intention is residue. What looks like mystery is delay. The trait remains because nothing is pushing it in either direction anymore. This becomes clearer when comparing Rho-negative blood to traits that truly were eliminated. Conditions that caused universal infertility or near-total unmistakable signal. Or incompatibility never reached that level. Its damage was selective, situational, and often delayed. It did not prevent conception. It did not affect every pregnancy. It required a specific sequence of events to become lethal. That complexity weakened selection's ability to act. In many cases, the immune response never developed. Some women carried only Rho-negative children. Some never became sensitized despite exposure. Each exception allowed the trait to pass quietly to the next generation. In an evolutionary standpoint, this inconsistency mattered more than the severity of individual outcomes. Selection removes patterns, not tragedies. When harm fails to repeat predictably, it fails to be removed. This explains why Rho-negative blood remained confined rather than spreading. It did not provide advantage, so it never expanded. It did not guarantee failure, so it was never erased. It existed in balance with randomness, carried forward by populations small enough that chance outweighed optimization. That balance persisted until modern intervention flattened the remaining cost. At that point, the evolutionary story effectively ended. Once reproductive risk was neutralized by medicine, the trait became invisible to selection. No force remained to reduce its frequency. Rho-negative blood entered a static phase. It would neither disappear nor increase for biological reasons. This is why discussions that frame Rho-negative blood as special or superior miss the point. Its survival does not imply value, it implies tolerance. It implies that evolution allowed it to remain because it never crossed the threshold required for removal. The trait endured not because it served a function, but because it existed within the margins of survivability. Understanding this reframes the discomfort. The unsettling part is not that Rho negative blood exists, but that evolution allowed a trait with direct reproductive cost to persist for so long without resolution. That fact challenges the assumption that natural selection always produces clean outcomes. It does not. It produces workable ones. Vera, negative blood, illustrates how biological systems carry unresolved consequences forward when conditions are fragmented. Selection was uneven, populations were isolated, behavior interfered, medicine arrived before elimination was complete. Each factor weakened pressure at a critical moment. Together, they froze the process. What remains now is a trait detached from its original cost, preserved by modern systems rather than natural ones. Its presence no longer threatens survival, but it still carries the imprint of past risk. That imprint explains its distribution, its history, and its persistence far better than any theory of hidden benefit. The central question, therefore, resolves into a simpler statement. Rho-negative blood was never removed by evolution, because evolution never finished acting on it. The process stalled. The pressure fragment intervention arrived, continuation replaced correction, and once continuation took over, removal was no longer possible because nothing remained to force the issue, leaving the trait embedded permanently as a record of how imperfect selection can be, when circumstances never aligned strongly enough to erase what should have disappeared long before history reached the present moment. This unfinished process also explains why Rho-negative blood continues to provoke confusion, even in scientific discussions, because it sits in an uncomfortable category between mutation and legacy. It is not actively evolving toward anything. It is not disappearing, it is simply being carried. And traits that are carried without pressure tend to attract interpretation. Because the human mind expects persistence to imply purpose from a biological perspective, however, persistence does not require intention. It requires only absence of force. Once the selective cost of re-compatibility was neutralized, there was no longer any mechanism capable of reshaping its frequency. The immune system still behaves the same way. The Rho protein is still absent. The underlying risk still exists in theory, but its consequences are intercepted before they reach the level where selection operates. The trait remains frozen in place. This freeze has an important implication. Rho-negative blood is now detached from the environment that once made it dangerous. The modern world does not resemble the conditions under which the trait originally persisted. Medical screening, controlled childbirth, and blood typing have removed uncertainty. What was once a silent, unpredictable hazard has become a managed variable. That management did not change the biology, it changed the outcome because of this. Looking at Rho-negative blood today can be misleading. Its present harmlessness can give the impression that it was never truly costly, but the historical record suggests otherwise. Infant mortality linked to Ra incompatibility was real, widespread and persistent before intervention. The trait survived not because it was safe, but because the cost was distributed unevenly and obscured by other causes of death. Selection is strongest when harm is consistent and clearly linked to a trait. Ra incompatibility required a specific sequence, and Ra negative mother and Ra positive fetus, sufficient blood mixing, immune sensitization, and a subsequent Ra-os positive pregnancy. Miss any step and the cost disappears. That complexity fractured selection. A fraying net pressure is a weak pressure. Weak pressure does not remove traits. It delays removal, and delay in evolution can be permanent if conditions change before the process completes. That is exactly what happened here. Medicine arrived before selection could finish its work. Once intervention became routine, the reproductive penalty vanished. From that point on, Rho-negative blood ceased to be visible to evolution. This outcome highlights a broader principle. Evolution is not a forward-planning system. It does not anticipate future environments. It acts only on present costs. When those costs are masked, delayed, or redirected, traits can persist long after they stop making sense. Where negative blood is an example of a trait whose cost was real, but never aligned strongly enough for long enough to force elimination. This also explains why attempts to assign advantage to rare negative blood fail under scrutiny. There is no evidence that it improves immunity, cognition, or survival under natural conditions. Its modern usefulness in transfusion medicine arises only because medical systems value compatibility across recipients. That value did not exist in ancestral environments. It could not have influenced selection, reflects discomfort with imperfection. People expect evolution to justify what remains, but justification, where negative blood continued because no single force ever acted decisively against it, across all populations at the same time. This pattern is not unique. Many human traits persist, despite being suboptimal, because selection operates under constraints. Population size, migration, culture, and chance all interfere. While negative blood is simply a clearer case because its cost is tied directly to reproduction. A connection makes its persistence more difficult to ignore. What the trait ultimately reveals is not a hidden story about human origins, but a limitation in how selection functions in real populations. Evolution does not produce perfection. When conditions are fragmentans, outcomes are fragmented as well. Raw negative blood survived in pockets because those pockets were isolated enough for chance to dominate. It survived across time because its cost was intermittent. It survived into the modern world because technology intervened before removal was complete. This interruption matters because it changes how the present should be interpreted. A negative blood is not an active evolutionary problem anymore. It is a historical bucket maintained by modern systems. Its frequency today tells a story about the past, not the future. Understanding that prevents misinterpretation. The trait does not point to superiority. It does not need mythology. It requires only an acceptance that evolution is constrained, uneven, and often unfinished. The discomfort comes from realizing how many traits may exist in the same category, features that should have been removed but were not, features whose costs were absorbed locally and forgotten globally, features that persist, not because they help, but because nothing ever forced them out. Negative blood stands as a clear example because its mechanism is known and its history traceable, but it is unlikely to be alone. It simply happens to expose a flaw in the assumption that survival equals evolution. In reality, survival often equals tolerance. Tolerance allows imperfection to persist. Imperfection accumulates when selection is weak, and when intervention arrives before resolution, imperfection becomes permanent. This is the context in which rare negative blood should be understood, not as a mystery waiting for revelation, but as a record of an evolutionary process that stalled before completion. The trait remains, not because it was chosen, but because it was never fully rejected. And once rejection became impossible, continuation became the only remaining outcome, as human biology carried forward the remnants of an unfinished filter, embedded quietly within populations, while the world around it changed faster than selection ever could keep up with. And that unresolved presence continues not as a question of what it means, but as evidence of how easily evolution can be interrupted. When pressure, fractures, and time moves on without waiting for correction, interruption also explains why raw negative blood feels unresolved, even now, because unresolved traits tend to linger in awareness longer than resolved ones. When a feature disappears, it leaves no trace. When it persists without function, it invites questioning. It is not asking what raw negative blood does now, but why it was allowed to remain when it still carried cost. The answer remains consistent. Selection pressure was never unified. Human populations were never synchronized. Risk appeared in some families and not in others. Loss occurred quietly dispersed across time and geography. There was never a single moment when the trait became overwhelmingly disruptive everywhere at once. Without that convergence, removal never completed. This matters because evolution does not correct gradually when pressure is weak. It waits, and waiting becomes permanent when conditions change. Once medical systems neutralize reproductive risk, The trait became invisible to selection, locked into place by intervention rather than biology. From that point forward, Rho-negative blood ceased to be an evolutionary question and became a historical one. Its continued presence no longer reflects natural filtering, but demographic inertia, birth rates, migration, and population, not survival advantage. This shift is often misunderstood. People assume that if a trait exists today, it must still be evolving. In many cases, it is not. It is merely being passed along unchanged. Negative blood belongs to that category. Its biology is static. Its meaning is retrospective. What gives the trait its weight? It points backward to a time when selection almost acted, but not quite, when cost accumulated, but not decisively when chance repeatedly intervened. It represents a process that stalled just before completion. Understanding this reframes the story one final time. Rho-negative blood does not challenge evolutionary theory. It illustrates its boundary. It shows how selection depends on clarity, consistency, and scale, and how easily those conditions can fail to align in human populations. What survived was not a solution, not an advantage, not a signal of origin, but an unresolved outcome. A biological remainder carried forward because nothing was ever strong enough everywhere at once to remove it, and once that opportunity passed, removal ceased to be possible, leaving behind a trait that now exists outside the reach of the process that once almost erased it and will remain there indefinitely unless some entirely new pressure emerges to challenge it again. This perspective also changes how the trait should be talked about going forward, because treating Rho-negative blood as an ongoing puzzle misses the point that the puzzle already resolved itself through interruption rather than explanation. Evolution did not fail to understand the trait, it failed to complete its response to it. Once that response was halted, the question shifted from biology to history. What remains is not an active problem seeking a solution, but a static outcome that reflects the conditions under which it survived. In that sense, Rho-negative blood functions like a marker, frozen in time. It carries information about population structure, isolation, and uneven pressure, rather than about advantage or design. Its persistence shows how easily natural selection can be redirected by human behavior, and later overridden by technology. The trait no longer needs to justify itself, because justification is only demanded when pressure exists. Without pressure, continuation becomes automatic. This is why the trait feels simultaneous. It reminds us that not everything present today earned its place through optimization. Some features remain simply because removal was interrupted, and once interruption occurs, biology does not return to finish unfinished work. It moves on, carrying the remainder forward as part of the species, without resolution or intention, and without any mechanism left to question its presence again. What follows from this understanding is a shift in how persistence itself should be interpreted, because persistence is often mistaken for endorsement, when in reality it can be nothing more than inertia. Rho-negative blood persists not because it solved a problem, but because the system responsible for removing problems never reached a decisive conclusion. Selection stalled, and once it stalled, everything downstream began to accumulate around that stall point. This accumulation affected more than biology. Over time, medical classification turned Rho-negative blood into a category, and categories invite attention. Attention invites narrative, but the narratives that formed were retrospective, built long after the evolutionary window had closed. They looked for meaning in what was already fixed. That is why so many explanations focus on origin stories rather than mechanisms. Origin feels explanatory when process feels incomplete. Yet the process is the explanation requires alignment. Annihilation of cost, alignment of timing, alignment of population, structure, rub incompatibility. Its cost appeared late, often after the first successful birth. Its severity varied, its distribution was fragment. Each fragment weakened the signal. Each weakened signal delayed removal. Delay compounded into persistence. This pattern also clarifies why the trait did not generate a compensatory advantage. In evolutionary terms, that is enough. Selection does not require a trade-off to fail. It requires only ambiguity. Ambiguity protects traits from decisive action. Ambiguity was present at every level. At the biological level, sensitization did not always occur. At the familial level, loss was varied. At the temporal level, consequences were delayed. Each layer diluted pressure further. By the time the pattern could have been clear, intervention arrived and ended the process entirely. This means Rh-negative blood crossed a threshold that many traits never do. It moved from being subject to selection to being shielded from it. Once shielded, it ceased to participate in evolutionary negotiation. It became fixed, not by advantage, but by protection. Protection is not selection, it is suspension. Suspension produces a different kind of persistence. It is not dynamic, it does not trend. It simply remains. And because it remains without changing, it invites interpretation that assumes intention where none exists. The human tendency is to fill stillness with story. Biology does not do this. Biology accepts stillness as an outcome. This acceptance is uncomfortable because it undermines the idea that survival implies refinement. Rho-negative blood shows that survival can also imply unfinished work. The trait is a remainder left behind when a process stopped prematurely. It is not evidence of hidden design. Once that frame is applied, many secondary questions lose their urgency. There is no need to ask what Rho-negative blood was for. It was not for anything. There is no need to ask why it appears special. It is not. It appears rare because of historical distribution, not purpose. There is no need to search for future consequences. Without renewed pressure, there will be none. The only meaningful variable left is demographic movement. Migration, mixing, and birth rates will slowly alter frequencies over time. But these changes are neutral. They do not reflect advantage or disadvantage. They reflect arithmetic. Evolution has stepped aside. Statistics has taken over. This transition from selection to arithmetic. When traits are governed by selection, they change in response to pressure. When governed by arithmetic, they drift. Rho-negative blood is now drifting. Its story is no longer about survival. It is about carryover. Carryover is not dramatic. It does not announce itself. It persists quietly. The quiet persistence is why the trait can feel unsettling. It is a reminder that not everything present today was shaped to be here. Some things are simply what remained when shaping stopped. This perspective also places a boundary on speculation. Once a trait is understood as a stored outcome, speculative explanations lose relevance. There is nothing left to uncover in terms of purpose. There is only context to understand. Gonchenks explains why removal failed and why continuation followed. In that sense, Rho-negative blood becomes less mysterious the more strictly it is confined to mechanism. The mystery dissolves when the question is asked correctly. Not why did it evolve, but why did elimination fail? That question has an answer. Cost, fragmented pressure, delayed, cost, population, isolation, and technological interruption. Together, these factors form a complete explanation. None are exotic, none require special origins, none require intention. They require only acceptance that evolution is conditioned by timing. It is not evolving toward anything. It is not correcting itself. It is not waiting to reveal meaning. It is simply present because the moment when it could have been removed passed without resolution. And once that moment passed, the process did not resume. That is why the trait endures without changing, why it provokes curiosity without offering answers, and why it stands as a quiet example of how biological processes can be interrupted and left incomplete, carrying forward their unfinished results indefinitely as populations move on and adapt around them while the remainder stays embedded beneath the surface, unchanged and unchallenged. Persisting, not because it must, but because nothing ever returned to finish what was once almost done. This embedded remainder also changes how certainty itself should be treated, because certainty assumes completion, and what this trait demonstrates is incompletion, preserved by circumstance. Rho-negative blood did not pass through a final evolutionary judgment. It slipped past it. The window during which removal was possible narrowed gradually as populations shifted, behaviors adapted, and eventually technology intervened. By the time the cost was fully understood, the process that might have eliminated it no longer had access to the conditions required to act. Selection depends on repeated failure that is visible at scale. It produced loss that was personal, localized, and temporally staggered. Such losses do not add up quickly enough for removal to occur before other forces intervene. Those other forces matter because humans are not passive participants in selection. Was alter exposure, culture alters timing, medicine alters consequence. But negative blood existed at the intersection of all three. Cultural responses to loss reduced repeated exposure, medical intervention removed consequence, population structures required intention. They emerged organically, together. They reduced the only pressure that mattered. This reveals a deeper limitation. Selection is reactive, not proactive. It responds to present cost, not future risk. Our incompatibility often imposed its greatest cost after an initial successful birth, which meant the trait could pass on before the cost appeared. That delay was critical. A trait that reproduces before it harm undermines its own removal. Rho negative blood benefited unintentionally from this timing, not because it conferred advantage, but because its penalty arrived late and inconsistently. As generations passed, this late cost blended into background mortality. In eras where infant death was common for many reasons, Rho incompatibility did not stand out as a unique signal. Selection relies on contrast. When many factors produce similar outcomes, none dominate. The trait survived within noise. That noise protected it more effectively than any benefit could have. When modern medicine reduced infant mortality broadly, the relative contribution of Rho incompatibility became clearer. But by then, selection had already been displaced. Medicine did not merely treat the condition, it changed the rules. The moment prevention became routine, the cost that once acted as a selective filter vanished. From that point onward, the trait became evolutionarily invisible. This invisibility persists. Rho negative blood now moves through populations without pressure. Its frequency changes only through migration and reproduction patterns unrelated to survival. Advantage: it is no longer tested. It is carried, and carried traits invite explanation, not because they do anything. Remaining without function challenges intuition. It suggests that biological systems can accumulate unresolved elements when processes are interrupted. These elements do not signal design. They signal contingency. Rho negative blood is contingent on a specific sequence of incomplete pressures that never align strongly enough. To conclude, elimination. Understanding this shifts focus away from origin myths and toward process failure. The question is not where the trait came from, but why the system that could have removed it never finished acting. That system requires synchronized pressure across populations, consistent timing of cost, and absence of interference. None of those conditions held long enough. Once interference occurred, the opportunity closed permanently. Selection does not resume after being blocked. Trait caught mid-process remain as they are. This is why Rho negative blood does not trend toward disappearance, even though its original cost is understood. Understanding does not recreate pressure. Only consequence does. This outcome reframes what survival signifies. Survival does not guarantee elimination. It does not guarantee purpose. It guarantees only that elimination did not complete. Rho negative blood survived because elimination stalled. That stall was not corrected. It was bypassed, and bypassing is final. In this light, the trait becomes a marker of interruption rather than exception. It demonstrates how easily biological processes can be diverted by timing, structure, and intervention. It shows that some features persist not because they fit the present, but because the past never finished processing them, and once the moment passed, the process never returned, leaving behind a trait that continues forward unchanged, carried quietly by populations that no longer experience its cost, and therefore have no mechanism left to question its presence or remove it again. This quiet continuation highlights a broader pattern that often goes unnoticed because it lacks drama, and that is the way unfinished biological processes accumulate rather than resolve. Rho negative blood did not survive because it reached a stage. It survived because the forces that might have removed it weakened before the task was complete. Once weakened, they never returned in a form capable of finishing the work. Selection does not circle back. It moves forward with whatever remains. This forward motion explains why the trait feels suspended rather than dynamic. Nothing about Ra-negative blood today is being actively tested by the environment. The immune mechanism still exists. The incompatibility still exists in principle. But the outcome that once translated incompatibility into loss has been redirected. Modern screening detects risk before it manifests. Intervention blocks immune memory before it forms. The cost that once fed into selection no longer reaches the point where selection can act. In evolutionary terms, the signal has been silenced. They do not improve, they do not degrade, they persist. Persistence without pressure creates the illusion of significance, because the human mind expects survival to imply value, but value is not required for continuation. Continuation requires only the absence of elimination. This absence reshapes interpretation. Instead of asking why Ra-negative blood exists, the more precise question becomes why it was never forced to leave. That question directs attention to timing rather than origin. It shifts focus away from where the trait came from and toward when removal failed. Removal fails when cost is delayed, inconsistent, or absorbed by other systems. Our incompatibility met all three conditions. The cost was delayed because the immune system needed exposure before responding. It was inconsistent because not all pregnancies produce sufficient blood mixing. It was absorbed because infant mortality had many competing causes. Factor weakened the feedback loop between trait and consequence. Slow selection becomes stalled selection when external forces intervene. External forces arrive gradually. Changes in childbirth practices reduced exposure. Cultural adaptations reduced repeated pregnancies. Metricky and further reduced pressure. By the time the mechanism was fully understood, the environment that once allowed selection to act no longer existed. Understanding does not resurrect pressure, only consequence. This explains why the trait now exists in a state that feels detached from function. Ra-negative blood no longer influences survival outcomes in a way that matters to reproduction. It has been neutralized. Neutral traits drift. They persist without direction. This drift is slow and unremarkable. It does not point toward disappearance or expansion. It points toward maintenance. Maintenance is not a biological goal. It is a byproduct of inactivity. When nothing pushes a system, it stays where it is. That stillness contracted onto the trait. Discussions that frame Ra-negative blood as special mistake persistence for purpose. But persistence can also mean neglect. It can mean that a process stopped caring. Evolution stopped caring about Ra-negative blood. Once medicine removed its cost at that moment, the trait exited the arena of selection entirely. Exiting selection does not make a trait meaningful. It makes it irrelevant to evolutionary outcomes. Ra-negative blood is now evolutionarily irrelevant. It does not shape fitness. It does not alter reproductive success. It does not influence survival probabilities in a way that feeds back into frequency. It is simply passed on. This passage without influence is what allows the trait to remain unchanged. Nothing is acting on it. Nothing is refining it. Nothing is removing it. In that sense, O-negative blood is not an active feature of human evolution. It is a residual feature of human history. Residual features accumulate when processes are interrupted. They are not mistakes. They are leftovers. Biology is full of leftover. Processes that require long periods to complete can be interrupted by rapid environmental change. When interruption occurs, incomplete outcomes persist. The discomfort arises from realizing how common this may be. Ra-negative blood is visible because its mechanism is known and its consequences were severe. But many traits with less obvious costs may exist in similar states. Traits whose penalties were diffuse, traits whose removal was interrupted, traits that persist not because they were useful, but because they were never fully filtered. This does not undermine evolutionary theory, it clarifies it. Evolution does not promise optimum outcomes. It promises only that what remains has not yet been removed. Removal requires pressure. Incompatibility. Never achieved alignment long enough for removal to complete. Once alignment failed, the window closed, medicine sealed it shut. From that point onward, Rho negative blood became fixed, not by advantage, but by protection. Protected traits do not change, they accumulate quietly within population. It is in back of unfinished selection. It sits at the intersection of biology and history, no longer shaped by one and not fully explained by the other. Its presence is a record of a process that nearly concluded but did not. Understanding this reframes the entire narrative. Rho negative blood does not ask to be decoded. It asks to be contextualized. Its story is not about origin or destiny. It is about interruption. Interruption of pressure. Interruption of consequence. Interruption of elimination. Once interruption occurs, continuation becomes automatic. Traits do not need permission to remain. They remain by default. Urivuv is the exception. Aspectimani. That escape was not dramatic. It was gradual. It unfolded across generations, diluted by chance and masked by noise. By the time the pattern was clear, the environment had changed. Selection had lost access, the trait stayed, and it will continue to stay, not because it is special, but because nothing remains to challenge it in the way that would be required to force a decision, leaving Rho negative blood embedded within the population as a silent reminder that evolution can be paused, redirected, and ultimately bypassed, leaving behind outcomes that were never resolved and will never be revisited as long as the conditions that once allowed pressure to act no longer exist and no new force emerges to reopen the process. Again, persistence without pressure reshapes interpretation over time, because once a trait is no longer tested, it stops being part of an active biological process and becomes part of a passive inheritance. Rho negative blood now exists in that passive state. It moves forward through generations without resistance, not because it earns stability, but because the mechanism that once challenged it has been permanently disabled. Selection cannot act on a trait whose consequences never reach the level of reproductive cost, and modern systems ensure that they do not. What remains is a quiet mismatch between expectation and reality. People expect evolution to clean up its outcomes, to resolve contradictions, to remove traits that clearly interfere with survival. But evolution operates only within the boundaries of circumstance. When circumstances fragment, resolution fragments as well. Rho incompatibility never produced a unified signal strong enough to demand elimination. At this species, instead, it produced scattered losses that were absorbed, explained. Above scattered losses shape behavior rather than genetics. Families adjust rebreasted shape behavior rather than genetics. Families adjust reduction. Communities develop caution around childbirth. Cultural rules emerged that unintentionally reduced exposure. Each adjustment softened the biological costs without addressing the cause. By the time science identified the mechanism, the evolutionary moment had already passed. Interversion reposed pressure. It became a condition technology could handle. Once handled, it no longer mattered to survive outcomes. Traits that no longer matter are not eliminated. They persist by default. Without persistence is not a sign of fitness, it is a sign of absence. Absence of pressure creates stillness. Stillness invites interpretation. One negative blood does not require explanation beyond the limits of selection. It exists because elimination never finished and never will. The process ended early. What remains is a biological remainder, carried forward without function, without direction, and without any remaining force capable of reopening the question or pushing the system toward a different outcome. As generations continue to pass and the trait remains embedded quietly beneath the surface, waiting for nothing because nothing is coming to remove it again. Over time, this quiet inheritance becomes so normalized that it fades entirely into the background of human biology, not because it resolved itself, but because its consequences were systematically removed before they could reach the threshold where natural selection operates. What once represented a direct threat to reproduction now passes through generations unnoticed, filtered through medical systems that intercept risk long before it manifests. In this environment, survival is no longer negotiated at the biological level. Decisions are outsourced to technology, protocols, and intervention. The immune system still behaves the same way. The incompatibility still exists. Only the outcome has been altered. An altering outcome is enough to erase selective pressure completely. When pressure disappears, traits stop evolving. They do not improve, they do not deteriorate, they remain suspended. While negative blood exists in that suspended state, carried forward, not because it is protected by evolution, but because evolution has been prevented from acting on it. Selection cannot remove what no longer produces reproductive cost. Without cost, elimination becomes impossible. Continuation becomes automatic. Its presence today reflects past population structures rather than present function. Isolation, migration patterns, and demographic bottlenecks left their imprint long before intervention arrived. Once intervention took over, those imprints were frozen. The traits stopped responding to environment and began responding only to inheritance. Persistence is often interpreted as endorsement, as though what remains must serve a purpose, but persistence can also signal neglect. It can indicate that a process stopped paying attention. Raw negative blood was not endorsed by selection. It was overlooked. It fell beneath the threshold that demands action and stayed there long enough for the environment to change. Understanding this removes the need for speculative explanations. There is no requirement for hidden advantage or ancient design. The trait remained because elimination never completed, and because the conditions required to complete it never returned. Selection depends on repetition and clarity. Raw incompatibility produced neither at sufficient scale. Gamete was real, but it was diffused across time and geography. Diffused damage weakens selection more effectively than minor damage. When harm is spread thinly, it blends into background noise. In ancestral environments, infant mortality had many causes. Infection, nutrition, trauma, and childbirth complications all produce similar outcomes. Without contrast, selection loses precision. Without precision, removal stalls. Behavioral adaptation compounded this effect. Families adjusted reproduction patterns. In response then, press altered. Timing, cultural norms emerged that unintentional. Minimize, stampos. Each response bought time, and time allowed interruption to occur. Interruption is decisive. Once modern medicine neutralized the reproductive cost, the evolutionary process ended permanently. Selection does not resume after intervention. It cannot act retroactively. Pressure vanishes, negative blood crossed that boundary and never returned. From that point forward, the trait became evolutionary inert. It no longer influenced who reproduced successfully. It no longer altered survival outcomes. It became a neutral marker, passed forward by default. Neutral markers do not disappear on their own. They persist until acted upon by new pressure, and no such pressure exists here. This inertia explains why frequency differences still map onto historical populations. Regions with high prevalence reflect past isolation, not present utility. The trait is a map of where selection nearly acted and failed. It is a record of incomplete filtering rather than a sign of specialization. Once viewed this way, the discomfort surrounding raw negative blood shifts. The unease does not come from mystery, but from imperfection. The idea that evolution leaves unfinished outcomes challenges assumptions about refinement. It suggests that survival does not imply resolution. It implies only that removal did not occur in time. Many traits likely exist in similar states, unnoticed because their costs were smaller or more abstract. O-negative blood stands out because its cost was tied directly to reproduction. That direct connection exposes the limits of selection more clearly than traits with subtler effects. Understanding those limits clarifies the story. Raw negative blood did not persist because it helped humanity. Humanity adapted around it when adaptation reduced cost and technology removed consequence. The opportunity for elimination. It is allowance. Allowance requires no justification. Once allowed, continuation is the default outcome. Biology does not revisit past decisions. It carries forward what remains. That carryover is why the trait now exists outside the evolutionary process that once almost removed it. The immune system still reacts. The incompatibility still exists, but without consequence. Irrelevance freezes traits in place. The story, therefore, is not about what raw negative blood means today, but about what happens when selection is interrupted before completion. Interruption leaves remainders. Remainders persist quietly. Over time, they become ordinary, not because they were meant to exist, but because nothing returned to challenge them again. As populations move forward and systems adapted around their presence rather than forcing a resolution, and that unresolved presence continues to pass silently from one generation to the next without direction or function, and without any remaining force capable of reopening the process that once almost erased it. The move forward without waiting for correction. As this understanding settles, attention shifts away from searching for hidden explanations and toward recognizing how fragile evolutionary processes really are when they intersect with human complexity. Selection works best in simple systems where cause and effect align cleanly, but human biology rarely offers that simplicity. Technology alters consequence. Rare negative blood existed at the crossroads of all three, and that intersection diluted pressure until elimination was no longer possible. What remained was not preserved by strength, but sheltered by circumstance. Shelter does not require intention. It emerges when systems overlap in ways that redirect outcomes. In the case of raw negative blood, immune reaction created risk, social behavior reduced repetition, and medicine removed consequence. Each layer acted independently, yet together they produced the same result. Pressure weakened before completion. Weak pressure cannot force resolution. It can only linger, and lingering is often mistaken for stability. Stability, however, is not the same as equilibrium. Equilibrium implies balance. What exists here is suspension. The trait is suspended outside the evolutionary feedback loop that once governed it. It no longer responds to fitness signals because those signals have been muted. In such a state, change does not occur gradually. It does not occur at all. The trait remains fixed unless a new force re-introduces cost at a scale large enough to matter. No such force exists. Modern medicine ensures that raw incompatibility rarely translates into reproductive events, the isolation that once shaped distribution. Culturorms no longer reduce reproduction. Every factor that once contributed to pressure has been softened or removed. The system has closed behind the trait. This closure reframes how rarity itself should be interpreted. Rarity does not imply danger. It does not imply advantage. It implies history. O negative blood is rare in some regions because those regions never carried it forward in significant numbers. It is common in others because isolation allowed it to persist. Neither pattern reflects present value. Both reflect past conditions. Understanding this prevents projection. The trait does not point forward. It points backward. It is a marker of where evolution slowed, hesitated, and ultimately stopped responding. It shows that selection is not a guarantee, but a process vulnerable to disruption. When disrupted outcomes remain unresolved. Unresolved outcomes are uncomfortable because they resist narrative closure. There is no lesson of improvement, no arc of correction, only continuation. Raw negative blood continues, not because it must, but because nothing intervenes. To stop it, continuation without meaning challenges the expectation that biology operates with purpose. Once a trait falls below the threshold for removal and remains there long enough, it becomes permanent by default. Permanence in this sense is accidental. It is not earned. It is inherited. O-negative blood inherited its place, not through advantage, but through interruption. Recognizing this strips away unnecessary speculation. There is no need to search for extraordinary origins when ordinary mechanisms suffice: fragmented pressure, delayed cost, behavioral adaptation, and technological intervention. Explain the outcome fully, each factor alone would not have been enough. Together, they halted the process. What remains is a trait that no longer belongs to the evolutionary present. It belongs to the evolutionary past, carried forward unchanged into a world where its original cost no longer applies. Its presence today is not a question to be solved, but a condition to be understood, a reminder that natural selection is not an all-seeing force, but a limited one, constrained by timing, structure, and interference. And when those constraints align against it, the result is not correction but carryover, leaving traits, like free negative blood, embedded quietly within humanity. As time continues forward without reopening the question, or restoring the pressure that once nearly resolved it, and as this understanding settles into the background of the narrative, the focus naturally drifts away from biology as an active force, and toward history as the container that now holds the outcome. Because once a trait exits the selective process, it no longer belongs to the present tense of evolution, but to the accumulated record of how pressures once operated and then failed to finish their work. Rho-negative blood now functions as a historical imprint rather than a biological driver. It tells a story not about what humans are becoming, but about what once nearly happened and did not. The immune system still behaves according to its design. Antibodies still recognize absence. Cells still respond to difference. But the chain between response and consequence has been broken. And without that chain, biology loses its leverage. Leverage is essential for change. Without it, systems default to stasis. Stasis does not require maintenance. It requires only that nothing disrupt it. In the modern world, almost every mechanism surrounding reproduction is designed to prevent disruption. Screen-eye identifies risk, intervention neutralizes it. Follow-up ensures stability. Each layer reinforces stillness. Each layer pushes the trait further away from any environment where selection could resume its role. The trait is discussed as a curiosity rather than a liability. Statistics replace stories. Percentages replace loss. Numbers are easier to carry than outcomes. When outcomes disappear from lead experience, the trait loses emotional weight. What remains is abstraction. Abstraction invites speculation. When elimination fails, people search for meaning instead. But meaning is not a biological variable. It does not influence reproduction. It does not shape survival. It only shapes interpretation. Interpretation does not feed back into selection. Rho-negative blood remains untouched by interpretation. Without cost, the process goes silent. Silence is what now surrounds the trait. Silence allows persistence. Without scrutiny, traits persist quietly when nothing forces attention back onto them. Over generations, silence becomes normality. Normality becomes invisibility. It means integration. Negative blood has been integrated into modern systems so thoroughly that its original disruptive potential has been dissolved. It no longer challenges pregnancy. It no longer shapes population structure. Those effects belong to another context. Chunk has changed, and with it the relevance of the trait. Relevance is always contextual. A trait can be critical in one environment and inert in another. O-negative blood crossed that boundary when medicine intervened. From that moment onward, it stopped being evaluated by evolutionary criteria and began existing under administrative ones. Administration does not remove traits, it manages them. Preservation without purpose feels unsettling because it contradicts the idea that systems trend toward refinement. In reality, systems trend toward stability when refinement is no longer enforced. Stability is easier than change. Stability requires fewer inputs. Once stability is achieved through intervention, it tends to persist. This persistence reshapes how future generations encounter the trait. For them, Rho-negative blood will never be associated with loss or risk. It will be a line on a chart, a note in a file, a compatibility consideration in controlled settings. The lift cost that once drove partial selection will exist only in historical records. Records do not influence genes. Only bodies do. Bodies now experience no pressure related to the trait. Without pressure, no evolutionary dialogue occurs. Dialogue requires exchange. Exchange requires consequence. Consequence has been removed. What remains is a closed loop where the trait circulates without effect. This closed loop illustrates a broader principle. It is an intermittent filter that acts only when conditions allow. When conditions change, abruptly unfinished outcomes are carried forward intact. Ho-negative blood is one such outcome. The lesson here is not about blood type specifically, but about process limits. Natural selection has boundaries. It cannot act without clad addition. It cannot act when consequences are masked or delayed. When those limits are reached, traits persist regardless of their original cost. Understanding those limits reframes the entire narrative. Rho-negative blood is not an anomaly waiting to be explained. It is an example of how biological systems can be interrupted and left incomplete. Its presence today is evidence of interruption rather than exception. Once interruption occurs and becomes permanent, the outcome stabilizes. Stability creates the illusion of intention, but intention is irrelevant. The system is no longer choosing, it is carrying forward without choice is the defining feature of inheritance. Once selection steps aside, Rho-negative blood is inherited, not because it is favored, but because it is unchallenged. Unchallenged traits do not disappear. They persist quietly embedded within populations, moving forward in time without interacting with the forces that once almost removed them, and without any remaining mechanism capable of reopening that interaction again. And as that unchallenged state continues, it gradually reshapes how continuity itself is perceived, even when it originates from interruption. And over time, the distinction between what was selected and what was merely carried becomes harder to detect. Rho-negative blood moves through generations as part of ordinary inheritance patterns, indistinguishable from countless other neutral markers that persist simply because nothing asked them to justify their presence. In such a landscape, biology no longer debates outcomes, it records them. And recording does not imply approval, it implies retention. Retention without evaluation creates a subtle shift in expectation. People assume that what is retained must be stable by design, when in reality stability can emerge from disuse of selective mechanisms rather than their success. When selection disengages, traits remain where they are, not because they fit perfectly, but because the criteria for removal are no longer applied. Rho-negative blood illustrates that disengagement clearly. The immune response remains intact, the incompatibility remains real. Yet the chain linking incompatibility to loss has been severed, and without that chain, the process that once nearly concluded has no pathway to resume. As generations pass under these conditions, frequency becomes a matter of arithmetic rather than fitness. Birth rates, migration, and demographic mixing slowly adjust proportions. Drift replaces decision. Drift is indifferent. It does not correct. It does not rubinize. It accumulates outcomes without regard to their origin. Where drift governs interpretation tends to fill the gap left by explanation. Stories arise not because they are needed biologically, but because he is not required for continuation. Continuation occurs, regardless of understanding. Rho-negative blood continues even as its explanation settles into background knowledge. Because explanation alone does not alter inheritance. Inheritance proceeds quietly. Each transfer carries the same absence forward, unchanged. Absence here is literal absence of the Rho protein, but also absence Prada. Over time, they create a condition where the trait exists without context. Without context, traits lose narrative weight. They become facts rather than forces. As the trait becomes factual rather than consequential, it blends into the broader category of human variation that no longer interacts with survival. Variation of this kind persists until challenged. No such reintroduction is occurring. Modern systems are designed to prevent it. Prevention stabilizes outcomes and stability closes. Evolution loops do not invite resolution, they maintain circulation. Negative blood circulates within a closed loop of prevention, classification, and routine management. That loop sustains presence without engaging selection. This separation between presence and pressure is the final state of the process. Once reached, it does not reverse. Evolution does not reclaim traits after management removes their impact. It moves forward, responding only to new conditions. New conditions do not include renewed cost for Rho-negative blood. Without cost, the trait remains untouched. What remains, therefore, is not a question waiting to be answered, but a condition carried forward by default, embedded within a system that no longer evaluates it, and as time continues to move on, that default persistence becomes indistinguishable from intention, even though it arose from interruption, and continues only because nothing returns to challenge it again. And as that condition continues to carry itself forward, it slowly reframes how absence itself should be understood. Because absence here is not a void, but a stabilized state maintained by systems designed to prevent disruption rather than provoke change. One negative blood now exists inside a protective envelope formed by modern practices that intercept consequence before it accumulates. And accumulation is the only mechanism through which selection ever exerts pressure. Without accumulation, nothing escalates. Without escalation, nothing resolves. The trait remains suspended in a long present tense when nothing new is demanded of it. And within this suspended state, time no longer functions as a corrective force, because time alone does not remove traits. It only provides opportunity for pressure to act. And when pressure has been neutralized, time becomes passive. Decades pass, generations pass. The trait remains unchanged, not because it resists change, but because nothing interacts with it strongly enough to trigger change. Evolution is not gradual by default, it is conditional, and those conditions no longer apply. As the trait circulates within populations, it becomes increasingly decoupled from the narrative of survival. Children inherit it without consequence. Medical systems note it and move on. There is no moment where the trait asserts itself in daily life, because it exists quietly beneath routine operations, structured to prevent surprise. Surprise is what selection depends on, and when surprise is engineered out of a system, selection loses relevance. This engineered predictability transforms the role of biology. Biology becomes something to be managed rather than endured. Management replaces exposure, and exposure is what once allowed traits to be tested. Without exposure, traits cannot fail without failure. Selection has nothing to remove. O-negative blood is now insulated from failure, not in a philosophical sense of safety, but in the practical sense of removal from contest. The trait no longer competes with alternatives. It does not need to outperform anything. It only needs to persist within a managed environment that guarantees continuity, and that guarantee now exists at scale. Scale matters, because small isolated systems once allowed partial selection to occur. Isolation concentrated effects. That amplification nearly pushed the trait toward removal in certain regions, but global integration reversed that dynamic. In diluted concentration, dilution softened impact halted momentum. Momentum is essential for evolutionary resolution. Without momentum, processes stall, and once stalled, they rarely restart, because restart requires reintroduction of the very conditions that caused harm. Conditions now actively prevented by systems designed for stability. Stability closes loops, and closed loops maintain states indefinitely. Continuation feeds back into identification, but never into consequence. A loop contains no exit. Within that loop, interpretation often substitutes for pressure. People ask why the trait exists because they assume existence demands explanation, when in reality, existence demands only absence of removal. As explanation fills the vacuum left by force, it drifts toward abstraction. The trait becomes symbolic, a marker of identity or difference. Yet symbolism has no biological leverage. It influences thought, not inheritance. Thought does not shape genes. Only outcomes do. Outcomes related to Rho-negative blood have been standardized. Risk has been reduced to protocol. Protocol removes variability. And variability is the substrate selection. Acts upon remove variability, and selection loses traction. This loss of traction reveals a broader truth about modern evolution. Many traits that once carried cost have been insulated in similar ways. Medicine reduces consequence. Together, these forces shift evolution from an active filter to a historical archive. An archive does not edit entries, it preserves them. Rho-negative blood is preserved as an entry from a process that did not finish editing itself. It remains readable but inactive. Its presence is informational, not functional, information alone. Introduction requires consequence, and consequence has been removed. The system has settled into maintenance mode. Maintenance mode favors continuity over correction. Correction requires disruption, and disruption is avoided. By design, modern systems are built to absorb anomalies rather than eliminate them. Absorption allows coexistence without resummation, where negative blood is one of those unfinished processes. It was neither fully selected against nor fully integrated as an advantage. It occupies a middle state that became permanent through interruption. Permanent interruption creates a peculiar kind of normality without justification. The trait is normal because it is common enough and harmless enough under current conditions, and that normality is contingent, not intrinsic. If conditions were to change dramatically, relevance could return. But current systems are oriented toward preventing such change. Stability is enforced, and enforcement locks states in place. This lock is subtle. It does not announce itself. It operates quietly through routine procedures and preventative measures, and over time those measures feel invisible. Invisibility reinforces the illusion. However, does not alter history. The trait mattered once. It imposed cost. It shaped behavior. That history is embedded in distribution patterns and genetic clusters. But history does not dictate present action. Present systems override past pressures, and override is final in evolutionary terms. Once override removes consequence, selection cannot resume. The trait remains outside evaluation indefinitely. Continuation does not imply error. In evolutionary theory, selection operates only when condition operates only. Selection operates. Incomplete outcomes persist because nothing revisits them. Evolution moves on responding to current pressures rather than revisiting old ones, and Rho-negative blood is not being revisited. As long as reproduction proceeds without cost related to the trait, it will remain untouched. Untouched traits do not drift toward resolution. They remain as they are. Remaining as they are becomes the final state, not resolution, not correction, but continuation. Continuation here is not active, it is passive. Passive states persist without effort, and Rho-negative blood persists passively. Passive persistence is difficult to interpret because it lacks drama. There is no ongoing struggle, no visible conflict, only quiet inheritance. Quiet inheritance is the hallmark of traits that have exited selection. They no longer announce themselves, they simply move along. This movement through time without engagement marks the end of the evolutionary story for Rho-negative blood, not an ending defined by conclusion, but by disengagement, because the process did not finish, it stopped, and stopping left something behind that remains not because it was chosen, but because nothing came back to remove it. And as generations continue to pass within systems that prioritize stability over disruption, that remainder stays embedded, carried forward quietly without direction, without function, and without any remaining force capable of reopening the process again. And as that quiet carryover continues, it subtly reshapes how future generations relate to the idea of biological risk, because risk that never materializes fades from awareness, and awareness is what once allowed pressure to accumulate. Without awareness, There is no anticipation, and without anticipation, there is no behavioral reinforcement that might have amplified cost. Raw negative blood therefore exists in a space where neither biology nor culture applies sustained force. Medical systems absorb it, social systems ignore it. Individuals rarely encounter it outside controlled context. The absence of encounter matters because evolution depends on repeated confrontation with consequence. When confrontation is removed, traits lose their opportunity to be evaluated. As evaluation disappears, so does urgency. What was once feared becomes routine. What was once feared becomes routine, rutina. Stability then feeds back into the system, reinforcing the very conditions that prevent disruption. Each generation inherits not only the trait, but also the infrastructure that neutralizes it. E is harder to dismantle than biology. Biology can change through selection. E persists through design. When variation is constrained, selection has nothing to work with. Raw negative blood persists inside a framework that actively suppresses variability in outcome. Pregnancy no longer carries unknown risk related to the trait. Transfusion protocols eliminate surprise. In such an environment, the trait becomes inert. They remain as quiet passengers within populations moving forward through time. Movement continues. Births occur, deaths occur. None of these processes interact meaningfully with the trait. It neither accelerates nor slows survival. It neither enhances nor diminishes reproduction. It simply passes through. Once outside, it cannot be judged by evolutionary logic alone. Its presence must be understood as historical residue rather than adaptive signal. Raw negative blood signals where a process once acted and then stopped. Stopping does not require resolution. It requires interruption. Interruption here was comprehensive. Cultural adaptation. Ruda. Together, these forces close the chapter without concluding it. What remains is continuity without direction. Direction would require renewed pressure. Pressure is absent. Absence persists. And as long as absence holds, the trait will continue to move quietly forward, embedded within systems that neither question nor challenge it, and without any final punctuation that would signal an ending to the process at all. And as that absence of final punctuation continues to define the state of the trait, it becomes clearer that what persists is not uncertainty, but a completed withdrawal of pressure, because pressure is the only signal evolution responds to, and once that signal disappears, the system does not seek substitute. Where negative blood now exists beyond the reach of evolutionary correction, not because it is protected, but because it is irrelevant to present survival outcomes. Irrelevance is not neutral in narrative terms, but it is decisive in biological ones. Traits that are irrelevant do not compete, and traits that do not compete are not removed. This shift toward irrelevance explains why the trait can feel both ordinary and unsettling at the same time. Ordinary because it no longer produces visible consequence, and unsettling because it resists the expectation that evolution should tidy its outcomes, yet evolution does not tidy, it filters, and when filtering stops, unfinished material remains. Raw negative blood is unfinished material preserved by a change in filtering conditions, and as filtering conditions change rapidly in the modern era, the lag between biological process and technological intervention widened. Technology moved faster than selection could respond, and that speed differential matters because selection operates across generations, while technology alters outcomes within a single generation. And when technology intervenes faster than selection can act, it preempts resolution, and preemption locks states in place. Locked states accumulate quietly. They are not dramatic. They do not announce themselves. They simply persist. And over time, the persistence itself becomes unremarkable, as what was once anomalous becomes normalized. Normalization is powerful because it removes the incentive to question presence, and questioning requires friction, and friction has been smoothed away. As friction disappears, the trait integrates into systems designed around predictability, and predictability favors categorization. Categorization favors management. Management favors continuity. and none of these steps require selection because they operate independently of fitness considerations. Fitness considerations once dominated the trait's relevance. Pregnancy outcomes determined whether the trait propagated, but that link has been severed, and severing that link transformed the trait from a biological liability into a managed variable, and managed variables do not evolve, they are maintained. Maintenance replaces adaptation, and adaptation requires stress, and stress is avoided intentionally, as modern systems are designed to minimize biological stress wherever possible, and minimization reduces evolutionary signal, and reduced signal reduces selection. This pattern extends beyond raw negative blood, as many traits that once carried cost have been buffered by similar systems where medicine corrects defects, infrastructure mitigates exposure, and social organization distributes risk, and each buffer reduces the role of selection, and together they reshape evolution. Slower processes allow more unfinished states to persist, and persistence does not imply benefit. It implies delay, and delay compounded by intervention becomes permanence. And permanence here is accidental, not earned. Accidental permanence challenges the assumption that biology always trends toward epinomation. Because it does not, it trends toward whatever remains after pressure is applied. And when pressure is removed early, what remains reflects interruption rather than design. Raw negative blood reflects interruption at multiple levels. Where genetic incompatibility created risk, cultural adaptation reduced repetition, meant global integration diluted concentration, and each step interrupted a different part of the selection pathway until together they halted it completely. Once halted, the pathway did not restart, because there is no mechanism for restart when the conditions that would reintroduce cost are actively suppressed, and that suppression is systemic, reinforced by policy, practice, and expectation that outcomes should be safe and predictable, is now embedded in society, and eliminating risk eliminates selection. Selection without risk cannot function, it becomes dormant, and dormancy is not failure, it is suspension, and suspended processes do not conclude, they persist as they are. As suspension continues, interpretation often fills the space left by action, and people speculate about meaning because meaning feels necessary when resolution is absent. Yet meaning does not resolve biological states, only pressure does, and pressure is absent. Absence of pressure creates a quiet equilibrium that is not equilibrium in the evolutionary sense, but stability in the administrative sense, and administrative stability. Bronner sees continuity over correction, and correction is disruptive, and disruption is undesirable. Maintenance perpetuates traits without evaluation, and evaluation would require cost, and cost would require exposure, and exposure is prevented, and prevention is reliable, and reliability stabilizes systems. This stability explains why the trait is now encountered primarily through records rather than experience. As medical files note it, blood banks classify it, and screening programs anticipate it, and none of these encounters involve loss, and loss is what once created evolutionary signal, and without loss there is no signal. Signals drive change, silence preserves states, and raw negative blood exists within silence, and silence is not emptiness but containment. And containment keeps traits from interacting with selective forces. As containment persists, the trait becomes part of baseline human variation that does not provoke response, and baseline variation is tolerated by default. And tolerance does not imply approval, it implies absence of challenge. Absence of challenge is decisive because traits that are not challenged persist indefinitely, and indefinite persistence does not require explanation beyond interruption, and interruption explains why selection stopped and why it did not resume. Once explanation reaches that point, the narrative no longer seeks origin or destiny. It rests on process, and the process failed to complete, and failure was not catastrophic enough to force resolution before conditions changed, and conditions changed quickly, making resolution impossible. Impossibility here is structural, not theoretical, because the structure of modern systems prevents reintroduction of cost, and without cost, selection remains disengaged, and disengagement becomes permanent. Permanent disengagement leaves the trait in a state of quiet continuation. It feels like an ending, but is not one, because endings require a punctuation, and punctuation requires decision. And no decision occurred, and the process simply stopped acting. And stopping without decision leaves the trait embedded within populations that move forward through time without revisiting the conditions that once nearly resolved it. As movement continues and life continues, and the trait moves with it, unexamined, unchallenged, and unchanged. Carried forward not because it is favored, but because nothing remains that could remove it again. And as that quiet continuation extends further, it becomes increasingly clear that the trait now functions less as a biological factor, as a structural back embedded within systems that no longer test it, where systems absorb its presence without engaging its implications, and routine replaces response. Routine dulls attention, and dulled attention eliminates urgency. And without urgency, there is no mechanism for reassessment. Reassessment is what once allowed selection to re-enter a process, but here reassessment never arrives because outcomes remain stable, and stability sets even when the underlying process remains unfinished. In this way, stability masks incompletion, allowing unresolved traits to persist without scrutiny. The trait moves through time, not as a problem to be solved, but as a parameter to be logged. And logging replaces experience, and experience is what once generated evolutionary cost. As cost disappears, feedback dissolves, and without feedback, systems do not adapt, they merely repeat. Repetitions reinforce expectation, and expectation reshapes perception, until the presence of the trait feels inevitable rather than contingent. Contingency is forgotten, and forgetting removes the sense that anything could have unfolded differently. That loss of contingency is crucial because evolution depends on branching possibility. Visibility narrows, and narrowed visibility creates the illusion of necessity. The trait appears necessary simply because it is present, yet presence alone carries no implication of purpose. Purpose is inferred after the fact, often incorrectly, when continuation is mistaken for intention. In reality, continuation here is mechanical, driven by inherited pressure. Inheritance without pressure becomes neutral transmission, and neutral transmission has no end point. It continues until interrupted, and interruption no longer occurs. As generations pass, the trait becomes quieter still, not fading but blending, indistinguishable from countless other variations carried forward under similar condition. This blending completes the withdrawal from evolutionary relevance, not through removal but through normalization, where what was once costly becomes administratively invisible and biologically inert, remaining present without asserting itself, and moving forward through time as part of a system that has no remaining reason to ask anything of it at all. And as that biologically inert state continues, remaining present without asserting itself, and moving forward through time as part of a system that has no remaining reason to ask anything of it at all, it becomes increasingly clear that the trait has transitioned fully from a biological factor into an infrastructural constant, something absorbed by systems rather than tested by circumstances, where systems are built to absorb rather than expose, to smooth rather than amplify, and in doing so they quietly redefine what survival even means. Survival no longer depends on raw biological compatibility, but on access to managed environments, standardized care, and anticipatory intervention. When consequence is intercepted, before it can cascade, biology loses its leverage. Selection does not argue, it measures, and what it measures must accumulate to matter. Accumulation no longer occurs. Each potential outcome is resolved early, quietly, and individually, preventing patterns from forming and preventing patterns from exerting pressure. Without pressure, there is no signal, and without signal, the evolutionary system does not respond. This is not an oversight. It is the logical result of optimization focused on safety and continuity, rather than exposure and trial. As those priorities scale globally, they create uniformity, and uniformity suppresses. Divergence is what once allowed traits to be sorted, amplified, or erased. With divergence minimized, traits that do not actively disrupt stability remain embedded by default. Embedded traits become part of the background architecture of populations, indistinguishable from countless other variations. Over time, this background thickens. It fills with remnants of processes that once mattered and no longer do. Each remnant is a record of a pathway interrupted before completion, a reminder that evolution does not clean up after itself once conditions change. It simply moves on. Moving on does not imply resolution, it implies attention shifting elsewhere. Attention, in biological systems, follows pressure, and pressure now originates from different sources. New pressures emerge from environmental change, metabolic demands, disease, landscapes, and technological dependencies. Those pressures occupy the system's capacity to respond or learn. Unresolved traits fall outside that scope. Irrelevance is decisive. It freezes traits in place. Frozen traits are not static in a physical sense. They are static in a selective one. They are transmitted without modification, because there is no mechanism acting upon them. Transmit without modification creates the illusion of stability. But this stability is conditional. Management is effective precisely because it removes uncertainty. Uncertainty once drove adaptation. Its removal transforms biology into logistics. Logistics tracks inputs and output, not fitness in a logistical framework. Negative blood is a category, not a risk. Cat routes are sorted, documented, and routed appropriately. Once routing is established, outcomes become predictable, and predictability eliminates evolutionary drama. Drama is not metaphorical here. It refers to variance, failure, loss, and uneven survival. Those elements have been systematically reduced. Reduced drama means reduced signal. Reduced signal means reduced. Each unresolved state adds to the archive of human variation that no longer participates in shaping the future. Tatipen requires consequence. Consequence requires exposure. Exposure has been designed out. This design choice was intentional. Forfe, ediforso, altered the evolutionary landscape. Bundefoso, once selection is bypassed consistently, it cannot easily re-enter. Re-entry would require reintroducing unmanaged risk. Modern systems are built explicitly to prevent that. Prevention is layered, redundant, and normalized. Normalization is key. When prevention becomes normal, it becomes invisible. Invisibles then vor estem. The present then projects itself forward, assuming continuity. Continuity becomes expectation, becomes policy. Policy reinforces structure. Structure enforces stability. Disruption is the catalyst. Evolution depends on. Without it, evolution recedes into the background, still present but inactive. Inactivity does not mean absence, it means dormancy. They exist as scaffolding rather than engines. Rho negative blood now exists in that dormant space. It is carried forward faithfully, precisely, and quietly, without feedback, without correction, and without pressure. Its journey through time is no longer shaped by survival but by administration. Administration does not ask why something exists, it asks how to manage it. Management answers questions of allocation and compatibility, not origin or destiny. Destiny, in evolutionary terms, emerges from pressure over time. Pressure has been neutralized. Neutralization, halted trajectory, leaves a trace. That trace is what remains visible today. It invites interrogation because it lacks motion. Humans tend to explain stillness with meaning, but meaning is not required here. Prosex explains everything necessary. A process began, imposed, cost, encountered, adaptation was interrupted, and never resumed. The interruption coincided with rapid technological and social change that outpaced the system's ability to complete its filtering. Speed matters when change accompanies faster. Incomplete results persist when conditions stabilize. Stability arrived quickly and decisively. With stability came insulation. With insulation came irrelevance. With irrelevance came persistence without participation. Participation is the line between active evolution and historical residue. Raw negative blood crossed that line. It now resides entirely undecided upon. Action requires force. Force has been removed. Nothing returns to apply it. As long as systems continue to prioritize predictability over exposure, safety over trial, and management over confrontation, that residue remains untouched. Time continues to pass. Generations continue to inherit. The trait continues to move forward, not as a question, not as a risk, not as a mystery, but as a quiet back of a process that stopped midstream and was never restarted while the world reorganized itself around stability, leaving no remaining pathway for selection to re-engage and no remaining pressure capable of asking the trait to justify its existence again. As the absence of questioning persists, the trait settles even deeper into the structural background of humanity, where background elements are not evaluated for meaning but simply assumed to belong, and belonging removes the final tension that once kept the process alive. Tension is essential for resolution. Without tension, systems drift toward equilibrium. Maintenance does not ask whether something should exist, only whether it can continue without disruption. Negative blood meets that requirement perfectly. It does not interrupt weeks, it does not destabilize populations, and it does not impose unparented ghost. Predictability is the currency of modern systems, and anything that conforms to it is preserved automatic. As preservation becomes routine, the memory of conflict fades. Fading memory reshapes perception. What once appeared dangerous is reclassified as manageable. What was once costly is reframed as neutral. Neutrality dissolves urgency, and urgency was the last remaining driver, without a reopened. The evolutionary force is mobilized. Correction requires motivation. Motivation requires visible loss. Visible loss no longer occurs. This absence of loss does not signal improvement in a biological sense. It signals containment in an administrative. One administrative containment transforms biology into an inventory of variables rather than a field of contest. WEMs are catalogued, monitored, and stabilized. O negative blood is no longer a contestant. It is a variable. FEMs persist as long as systems remain intact. Systems are reinforced continuously because they underpin survival itself. Undermining them to resolve an old biological inconsistency would contradict their purpose. Purpose now lies in continuity. Continuity protects life as it could be. This shift marks a broader transition in human evolution, from selection driven by exposure to survival shaped by design. Design anticipates outcomes and neutralizes extremes. Extremes once accelerated change, their removal slows it. Slow change allows unresolved elements to remain indefinitely. Indefinite presence does not demand explanation. Curiosity once drove inquiry into cause and consequence, but inquiry cannot substitute for pressure. Understanding does not remove traits. Only outcomes do. Outcomes related to this trait have been absorbed into protocols that function silently in the background. Silence becomes the defining condition. In silence, processes persistence without movement feels like completion, even when it is not. That illusion of completion is powerful because it allows attention to move elsewhere. Attention is finite. Evolutionary systems respond only where attention and pressure coincide. That coincidence no longer occurs here. As attention shifts toward new challenges, the unfinished process is left behind, permanently embedded within populations that carry it forward without awareness, without resistance, and without any remaining mechanism that could ever compel it to change again. And as that state of permanent embedding settles in it, reframes the entire relationship between biology and outcome, where biology no longer serves as a battlefield, but as a substrate managed by layers of intervention that sit between cause and effect. And as those layers thicken, the original signals that once drove selection are muffled beyond recognition. What remains visible is continuity without contest, a form of survival that depends less on adaptation than on orchestration. Orchestration favors reliability, and reliability tends on eliminating variance. Variance once revealed which traits failed under pressure, but pressure has been diffused across systems that absorb shock before it can propagate. Absorption interrupts feedback, and feedback is the mechanism through which systems learn. Without learning, nothing changes. Change becomes unnecessary. Necessity dissolves. The trait remains, because remaining requires no action. Action would require a reason. Reasons emerge only when outcomes diverge. This engineered sameness does not produce a single optimal form, but a stable range of tolerated forms, all maintained within safe parameters. All negative blood sits comfortably within that range, neither advantage nor disadvantage, simply present. Presence without effect gradually loses Nericon bronze. Noise is filtered out. Filtering now operates in the opposite direction, preserving what does not disrupt, while ignoring what does. This inversion marks a quiet turning point where evolution yields to administration. Administration bottomatizes order. Order bronatizes predictability. Continuation requires nothing from the trait. Beyond compliance with protocols, compliance is automatic. Now effort is redistributed across systems rather than traits. Systems carry the burden that biology once bore. That transfer was gradual, then sudden, then complete. Completer arrived without ceremony because it arrived as improvement. Improvement masked interruption. Interruption freezes process but lose motion. Motion is essential for resolution. Without motion, the system does not progress toward an endpoint. It stabilizes in place. Stabilization creates the illusion of an endpoint. Because nothing further happens, nothing further happening feels like closure. Kunet removes curiosity. Curiosity would ask what remains. Undirios. People begin to assume that what persists must have a reason. Reason is inferred backward. Inference replaces evidence. Evidence would require consequence. Consequence has been neutralized. Neutralization eliminates evidence. Without evidence, net to supply meaning where process has stalled, but narratives do not alter inheritance. Inheritance proceeds mechanism indifferent. It requires only replication. Replication continues because reproduction is decoupled from cost. Decoupling was the decisive step. Once reproduction no longer reflected compatibility section. Le primary metric, misguide action. Without metrics there is no basis for change. Change stalls. Stall systems accumulate residues. Residues are tolerated as long as they do not interfere with function. Function is defined narrowly as continuity of life within managed bounds. Rote negative blood does not interfere with that function. It is accommodated. Accommodation is passive acceptance, not endorsement. Would imply value. Value implies comparison. Comparison, impomitation, empomitition, persistence without participation, adines the final state. This state is not unique. It represents a growing category of traits suspended between relevance and removement, where selection was overtaken by intervention. Intervention accelerated faster than evolution could adapt. Speed created asymmetry. Asymmetry favored technology. Intermination once always habitual change. Change slowing created backlog. Backlog remains. Raw negative blood is one entry in that backlog. It is not exceptional in mechanism, only in clarity. Its past cost was clear. Its present irrelevance is clear. A contrave reveals that evolution is not an omnipotent force marching toward optimization. disruption, arrived in the form of protection. Protection was humane, necessary, and effective. It also terminated the process prematurely. Premature persist because nothing cleans them up. Evolution does not clean retroactively. It responds only to present pressures. Present pressures lie elsewhere. They demand attention leaves the bupic untouched. Untouched artifacts remain as long as the environment that neutralized their costs remains stable. Stability is actively maintained. Maintenance is continuous. Continuous maintenance locks the system in place. Locked systems do not reopen old questions. They optimize forward. Forward optimization bypasses unresolved pasts. Direction is now set by design goals, not selective outcomes. Design goals change faster than genes. Genes lag creates misalignment. Misalignment persists when it carries no penalty. No penalty means no correction. Correction is unnecessary. Unnecessary processes fade from instant. They do not steer. But negative blood is a passenger. It rides along within populations shaped by forces unrelated to it. Its presence neither accelerates nor decelerates the journey. It is carried because carrying is effortless. Effort is allocated elsewhere. Action follows urgency. As urgency dissipates, the trait settles into a long, quiet interval that has no scheduled end. Endings require decisions. Decisions require stakes. Stakes have been removed. Removal was intentional. Intentional removal of stakes was framed as progress. Progress here meant safety. Safety succeeded. With success came silence. Silence does not conclude stories. Silence does not confession can last. Indefinite expanded. Indefinite suspension feels like resolution, only because nothing contradicts it. Contradiction would require pressure. Pressure is absent. Absence holds. As long as absence holds, the trait continues forward unchanged, embedded within systems that no longer register it as a problem or even as a question, moving through time as a stable remainder of a process that stopped before completion and never found a pathway to resume. As that remainder continues its passage, it reveals a broader pattern about how unfinished biological processes are handled once societies gain the ability to buffer consequence at scale. Because buffering does not resolve tension, it redistributes it outward into systems that absorb strain silently. Silence here is functional. It prevents escalation. Without reckoning, there is no turning point. Turning points are where processes end or transform. Absent turning points, time stretches into continuity. Continuity favors inertia. Inertia preserves whatever already exists. Preservation is not an act of choice, but a byproduct layers of practice and expectation. Shape behavior. Bayou shapes exposure. Exposure. That chain has been severed. Severance isolates traits from outcomes. Isolation renders them inert in evolutionary terms, even while they remain active in a descriptive sense. Description catalog without consequence. Cataloging trajectory. Trajectory proceeds unaffected. As this mode becomes dominant, more traits enter similar states of suspension. Each one adds to a growing archive of biological history carried forward without influence. Influence now flows from different sources. Environmental pressures tied to technology, dependency, climate shifts, metric demands, and social organization command the system's attention. Attention is selective. It cannot process everything. It means remaining unnoticed. Unnoticed elements persist indefinitely. Indefinite persistence becomes normalized. Normalizing erases memory of contingency. Contingency is the awareness that things could have unfolded differently. Without that awareness, the present feels inevitable. Inevitability dampens is accepted as fact. Facts are not challenged unless they interfere. Interference has been engineered out. Engineering here is cumulative, not conspiratorial. Each improvement removed a small amount of uncertainty. Accumulated improvements removed uncertainty almost entirely. Uncertainty was the engine. Motion stalls without fanfare. There is no alarm signaling that a process has stopped. Life continues smoothly. Smooth continuation masks. Arrested dynamics are difficult to perceive from within the system they inhabit. Perception requires contrast. Contrast requires disruption. Disruption is avoided. Avoidance is reinforced. Reinforcement hardens patterns. A revision would require acknowledging unfinished business. Unfinished business, impost cost, contradicts the promise. Seist cost contradicts the promise. Seisty becomes non-negist that underwrites. Mon-negist. Logic yields, yielding leaves residues. Residues persist quietly. Quiet persistence is the hallmark of traits that have exited selection without resolution. Rho-negative blood exemplifies this state not as an anomaly, but as a clear case where the mechanism can be traced end to end. The trace shows interruption, not intention. It shows how progress can pause a process without completing it, and how that pause can extend indefinitely once the conditions that sustained it are locked in place while populations move forward, carrying the remainder along as part of themselves, without reference to origin, without anticipation of change, and without any remaining signal that would ever bring the process back into motion. And as that absence of motion becomes the defining feature, the trait fades further into a state where even its designation as unfinished begins to lose relevance, because relevance itself depends on interaction, and interaction has been systematically removed from the equation. In this condition, the trait does not await resolution because waiting implies anticipation, and anticipation implies an expected response that will never arrive. The systems surrounding it have been umted to ensure that arrival does not occur. Optimism here is not malicious or careless, but precise and cumulative, each layer built to solve a specific problem, while unintentionally sealing the pathway that once allowed biology to correct itself. Correction requires exposure to consolated and neutralized at every stage where it might have accumulated. Fragmented consequence cannot instruct selection. Selection responds only to totals, not fragments. When totals never form, the signal never crosses the threshold required to provoke change. Thresholds matter. Evolution is a threshold process. Below threshold, nothing happens. Rho-negative blood exists permanets. Below phrasis, gomesis. Below threshold, creates stasis. Stasis is mistaken for balance, but balance in place. Here, there are no opposing forces. There is only absence. Absence is quiet. Quiet systems feel complete because they do not call attention to themselves. Attention drifts elsewhere. Drift is not random. It follows urgency. Urgency now emerges from domains where management has not yet caught up with complexity. Those domains dominate discourse and policy and research. Meanwhile, traits like this one recede into routine administration. Routine removes drama. Drama once drove memory. Without memory, the sense of risk dissolves. Dissolved risk erases the emotional weight that once accompanied inheritance. Inheritance becomes procedural rather than consequential. Proceeds are followed, not questioned. Questioning would slow systems down. Speed is valued. Speed requires predictability. Deviation once generated evolutionary experiments. Experiments have been replaced by simulations and models that operate without biological cost. Cost is the currency of evolution. Without currency, no transaction occurs. The tracheation, without transaction action. Circulation without tranj. Bodies are protected. Protection depulses physiology from outcome. Decoupling stabilizes diversity. Diversity persists not because it is adaptive, but because it is harmless under current conditions. Harmlessness is sufficient for survival in managed environments. Managed environments do not ask traits to prove themselves. Proof is replaced by compliance. Either a trait can be accommodated or it cannot. Rho-negative blood can be accommodated easily. Ease eliminates pressure. Eliminated pressure removes the final lever that could have reactivated selection. Reactivation would require failure at scale. Failure at scale is precisely what systems are designed to prevent. Prevention is deeply entrenched culturally and technologically. It is reinforced through expectation, education, and infrastructure. It hardens paths channel behavior. Behavior shapes outcomes feedback into design. The loop closed. Loops resist change. Resistance is not active opposition, but inertia. Inertia maintains trajectory. Safety overrides evolutionary experimentation. Once allowed traits to rise or fall, its removal freezes, ranks great. Gradients drive movement. Without gradients, nothing moves. The trait remains where it is. Remaining becomes its only function. Functionless, persistence, challenge narrative. Without movement, inference collapses. What remains is description. Description would demand prescription. Prescription would demand change. Change is unnecessary. Unnecessary processes, not genetic. The idea that the trait matters at all weakens over time. Wakening ideas lose influence. Influence directs, reset. Without intervention, nothing alters its status. Status quo solidifies. Solidification completes the withdrawal from evolutionary relevance. Completion here does not mark an ending but a quiet settling into permanence, defined entirely by the absence of demand, where the trait continues to pass from one generation to the next, unnoticed, unchallenged, and unexamined. Not because it has earned its place, but because the system surrounding it has removed every condition under which that place would ever need to be questioned again. And as that surrounding system continues to stabilize the conditions under which the trait moves forward, it becomes increasingly clear that persistence here is not driven by resilience or advantage, but by procedural silence, where procedures absorb variation, and silence replaces evaluation, because the pathways that once carry consequence have been rerouted into safeguards, buffers, and anticipatory controls that intercept deviation before it can register. As loss was the only language selection ever understood, so in the absence of that language, the process becomes unreadable to itself, continuing without feedback, without escoche, and without any internal signal that would prompt reconsideration, as generations inherit the trait within environments that translate difference into categories, and categories into records, and records into routine management, where routine dulls attention, and dulled attention removes urgency, and without urgency, nothing calls for resolve through which unfinished processes once resolve themselves over time, but time here no longer functions as a testing ground. It functions as a carrier moving material forward unchanged, while the context around it becomes increasingly omit to prevent disturbance, and as optimization advances. It prioritizes continuity over inquiry, and uncertainty contradicts the mandate of safety that governs modern systems. So safety becomes the dominant value, and safety demands predictability, and predictability demands control, and control narrows the range of outcomes until variation exists only in form, not effect, leaving the trait present, but functionally inert within the larger structure, where inert elements, because they do not interfere with operation, and interference is what systems are built to avoid. So tolerance becomes the default stance, and default stances do not require justification. They persist simply because nothing opposes them, and opposition would require friction. And friction has been engineered out at multiple levels by biological and cultural, creating a layered insulation that prevents the reemergence of selective pressure, even in hypothetical terms. Because any scenario that might restore pressure is framed as unacceptable risk and eliminated in advance, which means the evolutionary question is not merely unanswered, but unaskable within the current framework. When processes cannot move, they settle into a state that feels like completion without ever having reached it, where the appearance of normality masks the absence of resolution, and that masking is reinforced by the smoothness of daily life, in which the trait produces no disruption, no visible cost, and no narrative event that would draw attention back to its origins or implications. So it drifts further into the background, becoming parts of the ambient variability that defines populations without shaping outcomes. And as ambient variability expands, the distinction between meaningful difference and neutral difference blurs until neutrality dominates perception and neutrality discourages further experimentation, becomability, neither required nor desired within systems calibrated to maintain equilibrium, so the trait continues forward, embedded within inheritance patterns that operate independently of consequence, carried along by reproduction, that is, decoupled from risk, and by care, structures that absorb incompatibility before it can translate into loss, resulting in a long-sustained present, as a problem nor as a solution, but as residue of a pathway interrupted by conditions that shifted too quickly for selection to complete its work, leaving behind a stable remainder that moves through time quietly aligned with systems that have no mechanism and no motivation to reactivate the forces that once nearly removed it. And as those forces remain inactive, the trait settles even deeper into the architecture of everyday life, where inheritance functions as a background process rather than a point of concern, and where background processes rarely attract scrutiny because scrutiny is reserved for disruptions, and this trait produces none within the managed conditions that now define reproduction, care, and survival. So its passage from parent to child becomes indistinguishable from countless other neutral transmissions that occur without comment, without record, beyond administrative notation, and without emotional weight, which further reinforces its invisibility. And invisibility is decisive because what cannot be seen cannot be challenged, and what cannot be challenged. So the system moves forward, carrying the trait not as a remnant that calls attention to unfinished business, but as a quiet constant, folded into statistical expectation, where expectation smooths perception, and perception shapes response. And response here is absent, not because of denial, but because nothing signals the need for engagement. As engagement fades the memory of prior conflict, fades with it, turning what was once a site of risk into a historical footnote that lacks urgency in the present. And when urgency disappears, motivation follows. Because motivation depends on stakes, and stakes depend on consequence, and consequence has been iced immense. So the evolutionary mechanism remains intact in theory, yet dormant in practice, unable to act without input, and input no longer arrives, because the channels that once delivered it have been closed, redirected, or buffered by layers of intervention that prize up continuity and safety over experimentation, and as those priorities harden, should be allowed to do, and those expectations leave no room for unresolved processes to reassert themselves. Meaning that the trait continues, not because it persists against pressure, but because it moves within a landscape where pressure has been designed out entirely. As landscapes without pressure expand, they accumulate more. Such traits, each one carried forward quietly, each one detached from outcome, and together they mark a shift in how evolution expresses itself in human populations, from a visible sorting mechanism into a muted historical echo that records what once mattered without allowing it to matter again. And in that muted state, the trait no longer participates in change, nor invites interpretation beyond description, remaining present as part of a stabilized system that advances through time, without pause, without challenge, and without any remaining force capable of drawing it back into a cycle of evaluation. As that stabilized system continues to advance, it further dissolves the distinction between traits that were once consequential and traits that were always neutral, because stability erases contrast, and contrast is the only condition under which difference becomes visible. So, the ray negative trait fades into a background category of variation that is noticed only when required by procedure rather than lived experience. And when experience no longer registers a trait, it ceases to generate narrative weight, which means it no longer participates in the stories people tell themselves about survival risk or adaptation, and instead becomes a static data point circulating through records, database, and protocols, without friction and without resistance, because friction once produced heat, and heat produced change. whereas now movement produces only continuity, and continuity reinforces the assumption that nothing is missing. And when nothing feels missing, there is no impulse to revisit the past or to reopen questions that appear already settled by their own absence of consequence, as this assumption solidifies it, reshapes collective understanding of evolution itself, recasting it, not as an active ongoing filter, but as a completed historical process whose unresolved elements are quietly tolerated rather than examined, and this tolerance expands outward, creating an environment where other interrupted processes can also persist without pressure. And precedent here teaches that unfinished biological questions do not demand closure if systems can successfully manage their effects, and management replaces resolution at every level from individual health to population structure. And as management becomes the dominant paradigm, it deprioritizes causality in favor of outcome, which means that as long as outcomes remain acceptable, causes are allowed to remain unexplored, and unexplored causes lose their ability to influence future decisions. So the trait remains locked in a loop of passive inheritance, carried forward by momentum alone, and momentum requires no justification. It simply continues until acted upon, and no such action is forthcoming, but the system has suppressed rather than solved a problem. An acknowledgement would imply vulnerability, which modern systems are designed to minimize. And as vulnerability is minimized, so too is the space in which evolutionary pressure can reemerge, leaving the trait suspended in a long-term equilibrium that is not adaptive but administrative. And administrative equilibrium favors repetition over transformation, ensuring that the trait remains present, not as a challenge to the system, but as a quiet confirmation that the system no longer needs to ask why it exists or what it might have become. As that administrative equilibrium holds, it slowly reshapes the emotional texture of human biology itself, where traits no longer carry stories of danger or advantage, but exist as neutral facts folded into the background of daily life. And when biology loses narrative tension, it also loses urgency, because urgency is born from uncertainty, and uncertainty has been systematically engineered out of the system through layers of prediction, prevention, and protocol, so the negative trait moves forward through generations without activating curiosity, fear, or meaning. And this absence of activation matters because myelin once functioned as a bridge between biology and behavior, and now attention has been redirected elsewhere, toward conditions that still generate visible cost, while traits without cost drift into obscurity, and obscurity is not erasure, it is dormancy, where something remains present but no longer participates in shaping outcomes, and dormancy persists indefinitely when no sex signal exists here, because every pathway through which consequence might once have emerged has been intercepted, rerouted, or neutralized long before it could accumulate into pressure. And accumulation is the only mechanism through which evolutionary systems register difference, and without accumulation, difference dissolves into sameness, and sameness reinforces the illusion of completeness, making the unfinished feel finished when no resolution occurred, and this illusion becomes structurally embedded because systems reward smooth operation over historical accuracy. And smooth operation depends on suppressing friction rather than interrogating origin. So the trait is carried forward as part of a managed human template where variation is catalogued but not tested, acknowledged but not engaged. And this pattern extends beyond raw negative blood into a broader shift in how evolution now operates within human populations, where selection has not stopped in theory but has been sidelined in practice by the speed, scale, and reach of intervention. As intervention accelerates, it outruns the slower rhythms of genetic filtering, creating a widening gap between what evolution would do left alone and what actually happens within protected environments. And that gap fills with suspended traits, quiet reminders, and incomplete processes that move forward without direction and without destination. As these reminders accumulate, they collectively regime normality, making it increasingly difficult to distinguish between traits that were shaped by adaptation and traits that simply survive interruption. And this indistinction matters because it signals a transition from evolutionary narratives driven by survival to narratives maintained by stability. And continuity does not ask questions. It preserves states and preservation favors inertia, and inertia carries forward whatever exists at the moment. Movement stops, and movement stopped here not through choice but through containment. And containment was motivated by a desire to reduce harm, not to resolve evolutionary questions. And that distinction explains why the trait remains neither celebrated nor eliminated, simply present within a system that no longer requires it to justify itself. And as generations pass within this framework, the memory of conflict fades further until the trait becomes historically weightless. Its past costs abstract, its former risk academic, its presence unremarkable. And this unremarkability, and nothing stands out here, and as nothing stands out, the process does not resume and the trait remains embedded within humanity, not as a signal of where evolution is going, but as a record of where it paused, carried forward quietly through time within structures that value predictability over transformation. As long as those values remain dominant, the trait will continue to exist as it does now, not advancing, not retreating, not resolving, but simply remaining present as a stable remainder of a process that ended without conclusion and moved on without returning. And as that stabilized condition settles fully into the background of human life, it becomes clear that nothing further needs to happen for the process to be complete, because completion here is defined not by resolution, but by exhaustion of pressure, and when pressure is gone, motion fades into quiet continuation, where inheritance proceeds without resistance, and systems move forward without revisiting the pathways that once shaped them. And in that quiet state, the trait no longer asks to be understood, nor does it need to be explained, because explanation itself is a response to tension, and tension no longer exists. As daily life unfolds, without disruption, the remainder blends into the larger pattern of human variation, becoming part of what is simply carried rather than examined, and what is carried without examination does not provoke reaction or demand interpretation. It simply remains, and remaining in this way marks the true end of the evolutionary story. Not through elimination, but through disengagement, where the forces that once acted have stepped away, and time continues without expectation and without intent, and without any mechanism that would draw attention back to the unfinished process, allowing it to persist as a silent record of how quickly conditions can change, and how permanently those changes can suspend outcomes. As that understanding fades into the background, it leaves behind not a mystery to solve, but a calm awareness that many things we inherit are not answers, but remnants, and that remnants do not ask anything of us, as long as the systems around us remain stable and protective and oriented toward continuity rather than challenge. And in that stability, the story reaches its natural resting state, where nothing more needs to be added and nothing more can be removed. And if this perspective helped you see the topic more clearly or helped you relax into the flow of the story, please take a moment to like the video, share your thoughts in the comments, follow the channel, turn on the notification bell, and good night.